In a landmark verdict, the Supreme Court today has toppled the presidential pardon given to Yograj Thakal alias Regal, who was earlier serving life sentence on murder charges of a social activist Chetan Manandhar. The government decision to provide the amnesty to Regal was earlier condemned by human rights activists, while Bharati Sherpa, the former spouse of the slain activist Manandhar, had waged a lone battle against the injustice surrounding the presidential pardon. Good evening, I'm Chitrakar. These are the headlines of the hour. The Supreme Court topples the government decision of providing presidential pardon to Yograj Thakal alias Regal. Regal arrested from Nepalganj. The ongoing session of the Federal Parliament to end from midnight tonight. Federal lawmakers say the lackluster performance of the Parliament has put at risk the governing system itself. Israel continued to pound Jabalia refugee camp, a hospital in Gaza serving cancer patients forced to shut down. US President Biden calls for a pause in attacks. And Oman stun host Nepal at the ICC T20 World Cup Asia qualifiers today. The Rhinos fall short despite Abibek's last over heroics to meet UAE in semi-final. The Supreme Court has rejected the presidential pardon administered to Yograj Thakal alias Regal, who was earlier serving life imprisonment. President Ramchandra Paudel had administered the pardon to Regal on the recommendation of the government on the Constitution Day on 20th September earlier this year. The joint bench of Justices Ishwar Prasad Khatiwada, Sapna Pradhan Malla and Dr. Kumar Chural issued the verdict earlier today, rejecting the presidential pardon administered to Regal on the recommendation of the government on the occasion of the Constitution Day. As per the verdict, Regal has to serve the remaining 11 years and 11 months in jail. The Supreme Court has also cautioned of issuing similar verdicts in the coming days and has said that the consent of the victim's family is a must while taking such decisions. Bharati Manandhar, whose husband was gruesomely killed by Regal, had filed a writ at the Supreme Court demanding to scrap the presidential pardon, which was granted on the recommendation of the Council of Ministers and implemented by the President. Hearing on the writ had been conducted relentlessly since Tuesday. The Apex Court issued the verdict today after the prosecution and defense from the respective sides had concluded yesterday. The court had ordered life imprisonment, convicting Thakal of killing social activist Chetan Manandhar of Nepalganj with a sharp weapon on 13 July 2015. The ongoing session of the Federal Parliament is to end at midnight tonight. The meeting of the Council of Ministers today held at the office of the Prime Minister in Singha Darbar decided to recommend ending the ongoing session of the Parliament to President Ramchandra Paudel. Meanwhile, the meeting of the House of Representatives was held earlier today where the parliamentarians aired their opinions. Leaders of main political parties have said that questions would be raised on the governing system if the parliament is not made effective. Speaking during the last meeting of the second session of the House of Representatives, leaders admitted of failing to make the parliament effective. Chief Whip of Nepali Congress, Ramesh Lekhak, said that the failure of the constitution would be devastating for the country. He opined that continuous parliament obstruction has also contributed towards making the parliament less effective. CPN-UML lawmaker Bishnu Paudel blamed the government of ignoring the issues tabled at the parliament. He warned the government that a lackluster parliament would not be able to generate outcomes. Meanwhile, CPN-UML Centre lawmaker Barshaman Pun expressed a dissatisfaction, saying that the trend of speaking indiscriminately at the parliament was on the rise. During the meeting, lawmakers had drawn the government's attention towards making efforts to release Nepali student Bipin Joshi, who has been captured by Hamas militants in Gaza. Congress lawmaker Sanjay Gautam observed silence for 1 minute, saying that the government had ignored the issues tabled at the parliament. Prime Minister Pushpa Kamal Dahal has said that preparations are underway for main political parties to unite and address the current political and economic crisis in the country. Addressing the 25th anniversary of Siddhartha Children and Women Hospital in Butwal, Premier Dahal claimed that main political parties have reached a consensus to appeal with general public. Premier Dahal said that the national economy could be improved and urged the public not to feel disheartened. He further added that the government had made preparations to introduce special programs to minimize economic crisis. Prime Minister Dahal inaugurated a 200-bed hospital and a library in Butwal's Amda today itself. The Election Commission has raised questions towards the sincerity of political parties as the issue of election expenses, which exceeds the ceiling set by the Commission every time, was raised at the meeting of the Parliament's State Affairs and Good Governance Committee. The committee had summoned the Commission's office bearers, including the Chief Election Commissioner, to discuss on the Commission's activities, as parliamentarians had raised questions on a range of issues, including election expenses and the election mechanism. Some parliamentarians shared their own experiences of the recently held elections and warned that the ongoing practice would in future discourage genuine candidates from running in the elections, as parties tend to prefer those with financial backing. Others claimed that the expenses ceiling set by the Election Commission was too low and that no election could be contested and won under the expense range. However, majority agreed that the election expenses had been going overboard. A few parliamentarians suggested to conduct election at all three levels simultaneously and to lift the provision of silence period. They also suggested the Commission implement rules to prohibit alliances ahead of election and provision for no vote. In response, the Commission highlighted the current scenario was a result of lack of honesty on behalf of the political parties. On a different note, Chief Election Commissioner Dinesh Thapalia informed the committee that preparations were underway to hold elections for the 19 posts that will be vacant at the National Assembly in February next year. Thapalia also informed that discussions were underway to hand over the printing press it procured to Janak Education Materials Center. Time now for our segment, Public Pulse, where you text us with your opinion.
Public Pulse.
Here's the question. What do you term the party leading the government announcing struggle programs? Your options are A, intention to hide flaws, B, vote politics, and C, genuine concerns. Voting is on. Type NEWS, select your option A, B or C and send it to 34001 to share your opinion with us. Time now for international update. Israel has pounded Gaza for the 27th day of a military operation to wipe out Hamas following the October 7 attack by the Islamist group. Plumes of smoke could be seen rising from blast earlier today as Israeli airstrikes continued on the enclave. Israel has been conducting an intense campaign of aerial bombardment in Gaza since the October 7 attack. Israel said 1,400 people, mostly civilians, were killed and more than 200 taken hostage, some of them foreign nationals or with dual Israeli nationality. The Gaza Health Ministry in the Hamas-run enclave said at least 8,796 Palestinians in the narrow coastal enclave, including 3,648 children, have been killed by Israeli airstrikes since October 7. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden said on Wednesday that Americans will now be able to exit war-torn Gaza and the administration will work hard to get additional Americans out of the region in the days ahead. An initial group of foreign nationals, including Americans, departed Gaza on Wednesday, the U.S. State Department reported earlier in the day, adding that Washington expects exits of U.S. citizens and others to continue over the next several days. While more aid trucks were arriving in Gaza through the Rafah border crossing earlier today, Israeli tanks and troops pressed forward towards Gaza City, meeting fierce resistance from Hamas militants. Explosions were heard as people were loading aid boxes onto trucks for delivery to the population in the enclave. The Rafah border crossing has become the focal point of efforts to deliver humanitarian aid and allow out injured people and foreign passport holders. Although Israel does not directly control the Rafah crossing, it monitors all activity in southern Gaza from Kerem Shalom military base and other surveillance. Pope Francis, with conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine on his mind, visited a World War II military cemetery on today to pay tribute to soldiers and innocent civilians on the day the Catholic Church commemorates all the dead. During the All Souls Day visit to Rome's Commonwealth Cemetery, Francis used a wheelchair to pass by the gravestones and lay flowers. But at the Mass that followed under intermittent rain, he stood for longer periods than he has in more than a year, indicating that his knee ailment was giving him fewer problems. The cemetery in an area of Rome that was the scene of street fighting during World War II is the final resting place of about 425 soldiers from Commonwealth nations who died in Italy during the conflict. In an improvised homily during the Mass, attended by several ambassadors from Commonwealth countries, Francis made a poignant stream of consciousness anti-war statement. He lamented the loss of so many innocent dead, but did not elaborate. China once again urged the United States to immediately lift sanctions and embargo against Cuba and condemned the United States for all the losses it has caused to the Caribbean nation, a Chinese envoy said at United Nations General Assembly session on Wednesday. Dai Bing, China's deputy permanent representative to the United Nations, said the sanctions and embargo imposed on Cuba for over 60 years have resulted in a loss of nearly $160 billion and led to a severe humanitarian crisis. From March 2022 to February 2023, the loss reached $4.867 billion, equivalent to 3 years' food expenses of all the Cuban people. Dai said the Cuban government and its people have never succumbed to unilateralism and hegemony of the United States. Although the sanctions and embargo have resulted in great pressure and losses, Cuba, the chair of the G77 in 2023, played a leading role in promoting South-South cooperation, successfully hosted the G77 plus China summit, and built important consensus for developing countries to join hands to cope with multi-challenges. China strongly urges the United States to lift economic, commercial, and financial sanctions against Cuba completely and immediately and develop normal relations with other UN member countries in accordance with the purpose and principles of the United Nations Charter and the basic norms in international relations, the Chinese diplomat said. And before wrapping up, here's a look at the top stories once again. The Supreme Court topples the government decision of providing presidential pardon to Yograj Thakal alias Regal. The top court warns against similar decisions in future. The ongoing session of the federal parliament to end from midnight tonight. Federal lawmakers say the lackluster performance of the parliament has put at risk the governing system itself. Israel continued to pound Jabalia refugee camp, a hospital in Gaza serving cancer patients forced to shut down. US President Biden calls for a pause in attacks. And Oman stunned host Nepal at the ICC T20 World Cup Asia qualifiers today. The Rhinos fall short despite BB's last-over heroics to meet UAE in semi-final. That's all for the moment. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.